October 14th, 1944. Erwin Rommel stood at the window of his home in Herrlingen, watching the autumn leaves drift across the garden. His left eye still caused him pain. The headaches from the fractured skull came in waves. It had been nearly 3 months since the Allied fighter had caught his staff car on that Norman road, and he still couldn't read for more than a few minutes without the words blurring together. He was 52 years old, the most famous general in Germany, the Desert Fox, the man who had made Churchill call him a great commander even while fighting against him, and now he was waiting. He had known for weeks that something was coming. The looks from officers who visited, the way conversations stopped when he entered rooms during his brief trips to headquarters. The careful distance that had grown around him since July 20th, when someone had tried to kill Adolf Hitler with a bomb hidden in a briefcase. Rommel had been in Normandy when it happened, commanding Army Group B against the Allied invasion. He had been in his car, racing back from the front to meet with Hitler, when the fighter planes found him on the 17th of July. By the time the bomb exploded in the Wolf's Lair 3 days later, Rommel was unconscious in a hospital. His skull fractured, his face torn, his left eye damaged. He had played no part in the bombing. But his name had been found on lists of men who might form a new government after Hitler was removed. Lists compiled by Karl Goerdeler, the former mayor of Leipzig, who had been part of the conspiracy. Rommel had never met Goerdeler. He would later tell his son this in the final minutes of his life. But he had met others, generals who whispered about ending the war, officers who spoke carefully about Germany's future. He had listened. He had even agreed that something needed to change, that the war was lost, that continuing meant only more destruction. But agreeing that Hitler should be removed from power was different from planting a bomb. Rommel was a soldier. He had wanted Hitler arrested, put on trial, removed through military authority, not murdered, not with explosives that might kill everyone in the room. It hadn't mattered. The Gestapo had found the lists. They had arrested hundreds. The People's Court, under the shrieking Roland Freisler, had sentenced dozens to death by hanging. Slowly, on meat hooks with piano wire. Hitler had ordered the executions filmed so he could watch them, and now they were coming for Rommel. His wife, Lucy, was in the house. Their son, Manfred, was home on leave from his anti-aircraft unit. 15 years old, wearing his Luftwaffe auxiliary uniform. Rommel had asked him to stay close today. He didn't say why. The car arrived just after noon. Manfred saw it first from an upstairs window. A dark green Wehrmacht vehicle moving slowly up the drive. 2 officers in the back seat. He called down to his father. Rommel's face changed. Something settled in his expression, a kind of resignation that Manfred had never seen before. His father straightened his uniform jacket, the one without medals because he was technically still on medical leave. He walked to the door. The 2 officers climbed out of the car. General Wilhelm Burgdorf, Hitler's chief Wehrmacht adjutant. General Ernst Meisel from the Army Personnel Office. Both men Rommel knew. Burgdorf was stocky, hard-faced, a committed Nazi. Meisel was quieter, less certain in his movements. They saluted. Rommel returned it. They asked to speak with him privately. Rommel led them into his study. He asked Manfred to wait outside but stay in the house. The door closed. Lucy Rommel found her son in the hallway. She had been married to Erwin for 27 years. She knew her husband's moods, his silences, the way he carried tension in his shoulders. She had known something was wrong for weeks. Now she stood with Manfred, both of them listening to the low voices from behind the door, unable to make out words. 15 minutes passed. The study door opened. Rommel came out. His face was pale but composed. He asked Lucy and Manfred to come upstairs with him to their bedroom. The 2 generals remained in the study. In the bedroom, Rommel closed the door. He looked at his wife and son. When he spoke, his voice was steady, but his hands trembled slightly. Quote. Lucy gasped. Manfred felt the room tilt. Rommel continued, speaking quickly now, as if he needed to get the words out before something stopped him. Quote 1. He shook his head. Quote. He explained what Bergdorf had told him. The Gestapo had evidence, testimony from arrested conspirators, his name in documents. Whether he had actually participated didn't matter anymore. The decision had been made at the highest level, by Hitler himself. But there was a choice. He could come to Berlin, stand trial before the People's Court, be publicly denounced as a traitor. The trial would be a spectacle, the verdict predetermined. The sentence, death. And after his execution, his family would be persecuted. Lucy arrested. Manfred's future destroyed. The Rommel name dragged through mud, or he could take poison. Now, today, within the hour, he would die quickly. The cause of death would be listed as complications from his injuries in Normandy, a cerebral embolism. He would receive a state funeral with full military honors. His field marshal's pension would continue to Lucy, and his family would be protected. Safe, untouched, Rommel said. Lucy was crying. Manfred stood frozen, trying to process what his father was saying. This couldn't be real. This was Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, Germany's most celebrated commander, the man whose Africa Corps had nearly driven the British out of Egypt, the man who had defended Normandy against the entire Allied invasion force. But it was real. The two generals downstairs had brought a small capsule. Cyanide. Fast-acting. They had their orders. Rommel would die today, one way or another. The only question was how, and what would happen to his family afterward. Rommel had already made his decision. He told Lucy and Manfred that he would take the poison. He would not give the Nazis the satisfaction of a show trial. He would not let them destroy his family. This was the only way to protect them. He had perhaps 10 minutes left. He spent them saying goodbye. He held Lucy. He told Manfred to take care of his mother. He spoke about practical matters, about the house, about finances, about Manfred's future. He was a soldier until the end, organizing, planning, ensuring his family would be provided for. Then he put on his long leather coat, the one he had worn in North Africa. He picked up his field marshal's baton. He looked at his wife and son one final time. Quote 5, he said again. Then he walked downstairs. Bergdorf and Monsieur were waiting. Rommel spoke with them briefly. The conversation was quiet, formal. No shouting, no drama. Just a field marshal receiving his final orders. He walked outside. Manfred and Lucy watched from the window. The car was waiting, engine running. An SS driver at the wheel, Master Sergeant Heinrich Deuss. Rommel climbed into the back seat. Bergdorf and Meisel got in beside him. The car drove away. Down the drive, past the garden where Rommel had stood that morning watching leaves fall. Through the village of Herrlingen, into the woods just outside town. 5 minutes later, the car stopped on a quiet forest road. What happened in those final moments, only 3 men knew for certain. Bergdorf and Meisel would later file their reports. The driver would give his testimony. But the details varied slightly between accounts, the way details always do when men describe something they wish they hadn't witnessed. Rommel took the capsule. Cyanide works by preventing cells from using oxygen. The body suffocates from within. Despite what Bergdorf had promised about 3 seconds, death took longer. Minutes, not seconds. Rommel convulsed. His breathing stopped. His heart ceased. The Desert Fox died in the back of a Wehrmacht car on a forest road in southern Germany, murdered by the regime he had served. Bergdorf and Meisel had the driver take them to a hospital in Ulm. They brought Rommel's body inside. The doctors were told he had suffered a cerebral embolism, a complication from his head injuries in Normandy. They were told to sign the death certificate without asking questions. The doctors signed. At the house in Herrlingen, Lucy and Manfred waited. They knew But they waited anyway, hoping somehow they were wrong, that their husband and father would walk back through the door. The phone rang around 1 o'clock. A doctor from the hospital. Field Marshal Rommel had died of a cerebral embolism. The family should come to identify the body. Lucy and Manfred drove to Ulm. They were taken to a room where Rommel lay on a table. His face was distorted. His expression showed pain. This was not what a peaceful death from an embolism looked like. But they said nothing. They identified the body. They played their part in the lie because that was the price of their survival. The next day, the announcement came from Berlin. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, Germany's most famous general, had died from complications related to injuries sustained during an enemy air attack in Normandy. The Führer was deeply saddened. A state funeral would be held. The German people mourned. Rommel had been genuinely popular, one of the few Nazi-era military commanders who was respected even by his enemies. Letters poured in from across Germany. Soldiers who had served under him in France, in North Africa, in Normandy. Civilians who had seen him as a symbol of military honor in an increasingly dishonorable regime. None of them knew the truth. The funeral took place on October 18th in Ulm. It was a massive ceremony. Thousands attended. The streets were lined with soldiers. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, who had commanded the Western Front, gave the eulogy. He spoke of Rommel's brilliance as a commander, his courage, his service to Germany. Hitler sent a massive wreath. He did not attend. He never attended funerals if he could avoid them, and besides, he knew what had really happened. He had ordered it. Lucy and Manfred stood at the graveside. They accepted condolences from generals and officials who had no idea they were shaking hands with a murdered man's family. They maintained the fiction because that was the agreement. That was the price. Manfred would keep the secret for years. Only after the war, when the full scope of Nazi crimes became public, when there was no longer any reason to protect the regime's lies, did he tell the truth about what had happened that October day. His testimony became the primary source for understanding Rommel's final hours. The story revealed something about how the Nazi regime operated in its final year. By October 1944, Germany was clearly losing the war. The Allies had liberated France. The Soviets were pushing into Eastern Europe. German cities were being bombed into rubble. The war was lost, and many in the military leadership knew it. But Hitler could not tolerate dissent, could not accept that his most famous general might have agreed, even passively, with those who wanted to end his rule. So he eliminated Rommel, but carefully, with the fiction of choice, with the pretense of honor, with a state funeral and a lie that made it seem like a tragedy rather than a murder. It was efficient. It was cruel. It sent a message to every other general who might be wavering. Step out of line, and this is what happens. We will kill you, but we will make it look like something else. We will force you to participate in your own death. We will make your family watch. And it worked. After Rommel's death, no senior military commander openly opposed Hitler. They followed orders until the very end, even as the Reich collapsed around them. Some from conviction, some from fear. Some because they had seen what happened to the Desert Fox and decided that survival required obedience. Rommel's death was not the heroic end that his propaganda image might have suggested. There was no last stand, no dramatic battlefield death, no final charge against overwhelming odds. There was just a man in his study, being told he had to die, being given a choice that was no choice at all, and deciding that protecting his family mattered more than fighting back. In those final minutes with Lucy and Manfred, Rommel could have refused. He could have told Bergdorf and Maisel to go to hell. He could have tried to fight, to escape, to make them drag him to Berlin in chains. But he knew what that would mean. The show trial, the torture, the execution, and worse, what would happen to Lucy and Manfred afterward. So he made the calculation. His life for theirs, his silence for their safety. He put on his coat, picked up his baton, and walked out to the car. The question that haunted historians afterward was whether Rommel actually was part of the conspiracy. The evidence suggests he knew of resistance circles. He had met with some conspirators, including General Karl Heinrich von Stülpnagel, the military governor of France, who was deeply involved in the plot. Rommel had agreed that the war was lost and that Hitler needed to be removed. But he had not known about the bomb. He had not participated in the planning of the July 20th assassination attempt. His vision had been different. A military coup, Hitler arrested, a negotiated peace with the Western Allies while continuing to fight the Soviets. It was a fantasy, built on the delusion that the Allies would accept anything less than total surrender. But it was what Rommel had believed. Whether that level of involvement justified the accusation of treason is debatable. In any functioning legal system, probably not. Rommel had not committed any overt act against the regime. He had listened to proposals, he had expressed opinions, he had not acted. But Nazi Germany in October 1944 was not a functioning legal system. It was a dictatorship in its death throes, lashing out at anyone who might threaten the Führer's absolute control. Evidence didn't matter. Due process didn't matter. What mattered was eliminating anyone who might serve as a rallying point for opposition. And Rommel, with his fame and his popularity, was exactly that kind of threat. Even wounded, even in retirement, his name carried weight. If he had spoken out against continuing the war, others might have listened. If he had called for Hitler's removal, it might have sparked something. So Hitler had him killed. Quietly, with the pretense of honor, with a lie that would preserve Rommel's reputation while eliminating the man himself. The poison worked exactly as promised. 3 seconds might have been an exaggeration, but it was fast enough. Rommel died in that car, in those woods, with 2 generals watching. His body was taken to a hospital. The lie was established. The funeral was planned, and Lucy and Manfred, standing at that graveside 4 days later, had to listen to Field Marshal von Rundstedt praise the Führer's grief at losing such a valuable commander. Had to watch as Hitler's wreath was laid at the coffin. Had to accept condolences from men who worked for the regime that had murdered their husband and father. They did it because they had no choice, because that was the agreement, because Rommel had died to keep them safe, and honoring that sacrifice meant playing along with the lie. Manfred Rommel survived the war. He went on to have a distinguished career in politics, serving as mayor of Stuttgart from 1974 to 1996. He was known as a moderate, a voice for reconciliation, a man who tried to build a democratic Germany on the ruins of the Nazi state. He never forgot what happened to his father. In interviews late in life, he spoke about that October day, about his father's calmness, about the impossible choice, about watching the car drive away, knowing his father would not return. He also spoke about his father's legacy, about how Rommel had been used by Nazi propaganda, turned into a symbol of German military prowess, about how that image had persisted after the war, in books and films that portrayed him as the good German, the honorable commander who had nothing to do with Nazi atrocities. The reality was more complicated. Rommel had served Hitler. He had commanded German forces in invasions of Poland, France, and North Africa. He had been part of the Nazi war machine. Whether he personally committed war crimes is debated by historians, but he had certainly enabled a criminal regime. Yet he had also, in the end, been murdered by that regime. For the crime of possibly, maybe agreeing with others that Hitler should be removed. For having his name on a list. For being too famous, too respected, too potentially dangerous to leave alive. That was the choice Hitler gave him. Die quietly or die publicly and take your family down with you. Rommel chose quietly. On that October morning, standing at his window, watching leaves fall, he had known this was coming. He had known since July that the net was closing. He had known that his injuries in Normandy, which had seemed like bad luck at the time, had probably saved him from immediate arrest. But he had known the reckoning would come. When Bergdorf and Maisel arrived, he was ready. He had already decided what he would do. He had already made his calculation. His life was forfeit, but his family could still be saved. So when they offered him the capsule, told him he had 15 minutes, gave him the choice that was no choice at all, he took it. He said goodbye to his wife and son. He walked outside. He got in the car, and in a forest outside Herlingen, on a quiet road where autumn leaves drifted across the pavement, the desert fox took poison and died. The official story said cerebral embolism. The funeral said hero's death. The wreath from Hitler said the Führer mourns. But Manfred Rommel knew the truth. His father had been murdered, forced to commit suicide by the regime he had served, given poison and 15 minutes and told to die quietly. That was what Hitler ordered when he ordered Rommel to die. Not just death, but complicity in death. Not just murder, but suicide. Not just an execution, but a performance where the victim had to play along, had to maintain the fiction, had to die with dignity so his family could live. And Rommel, calculating until the end, choosing the lesser evil, protecting what he could still protect, had obeyed that final order. He died at 52, in the back of a car, in a forest, alone except for the men who had brought him there to die. The Desert Fox, the most famous general in Germany, murdered by his own government for the crime of being too famous, too respected, and possibly too willing to imagine a Germany without Adolf Hitler.